All right. Marxism-Leninism, as we move left to right on the spectrum, Karl Marx did say that the ultimate cleavage in history was one of class and that there would always be class struggle in an industrialized capitalist society between the ownership class, the bourgeoisie, and the exploited working class, the proletariat. The revolutionary sequence Marx lays this out nicely in terms of beginning with a series of economic crises in which you have a proletariat in the situation of immiseration, low wages, bad working conditions, long hours. The proletariat would then develop a revolutionary class consciousness on their own. After that, they would seize the power of production and distribution, establish a temporary stage of socialism with the dictatorship of the proletariat before they eventually allowed the state to wither away, and then we would enter into a period of communism where you would have people live collectively according to that Marxist phrase, from each according to ability to each according to need. And that's a very, very important bullet for you to understand that. No private ownership, the goal collective equality, totally egalitarian. And that was the gist of Marxism. Remember that you know now from the Russian unit that Lenin added in the principles of democratic centralism. Lenin also added in the notion of the vanguard party, because Lenin did not believe that the revolutionary class consciousness was going to be realistic. From a socialist standpoint, as we move a little bit further to the right now, the goal is collective equality, but also maintaining individual freedoms. There's a combination of both public and private ownership. The commanding heights, key industry, when you're talking about things like education and healthcare and telecommunications in the modern era and so forth, nationalized, and so we have a nationalization of the commanding heights of industry. High taxation in a progressive way as your taxes increase within each bracket, the more money that you make to provide for the public good and for the social benefits of a socialist system. Peaceful politics in this means, and we refer to Western Europeans as social democrats, or the process by which Western Europeans partake in socialist politics as social democracy. The tricky liberalisms don't have to be so tricky as long as you keep in mind that the root phrase of liberal is always going to be individual rights and freedoms, both politically and economically. So remember, when we do talk about economic liberalization, we're talking about the free market. If we talk about political liberalization, it is democracy. The gist of liberalism really was to restrict the power of the state and protect the individual rights and freedoms of the individual. And that morphed into several offshoots over the course of time. Social liberalism, really more of today's U.S. Democrats, where you have individual rights and freedoms protected, but more state involvement, more social welfare spending, and so forth. Not to the degree that socialism would impart, but more than classic liberals would certainly approve of. And then you have neoliberalism with the Margaret Thatcher model being one of the first to implement it on a national scale, where you have that modern economic interpretation of classic liberalism and neoliberals espousing things like lower taxes, reduced social spending, the promotion of free trade, and so on. Conservatism at its root, and don't forget it because you tend to, it is all about continuity with the past and tradition. It doesn't matter what country you're in. So if it is continuity with the past in Russia, you have conservatives being communists, and in the U.S. that's going to differ markedly from that. So that does differ from country to country. U.S. conservatives tend to be neoliberal economically, have a link to the dominant religion in terms of Christianity, focus on social issues. Europeans less focused on social issues by a long shot, very much more accepting of that principle of noblesse oblige, whereby the well-to-do have an obligation to help provide for the less fortunate through higher taxation rates and the promotion of nationalized health care and things such as that. And then we have neoconservatism, whereby you have a focus on the active foreign policy, spread of democracy, and the spread of Western values, if you will. Selection methods in electoral systems are really, really critical. You do have to have a grasp on these very, very strongly, and in regard to not only what the systems are, but what their effects are and how we see that play out in each particular country. Remember that SMD is single member district. That means that one person represents an individual geographic constituency. That is oftentimes, but not always, paired with the plurality electoral method, whereby you have simply the candidate with the most vote wins. That is also called first past the post, or FPTP, winner take all. Whoever gets the most most votes wins. Sorry. The plurality system, or first past the post system, tends to concentrate votes around two major political parties, and they both tend to be catch-all. That is Duverger's law. The incentive is to be catch-all parties because you merely need the most votes to win, and there is no reward for second place. The majority runoff method, you have candidates run for an individual office, and the winner must have a majority, which is 50% plus one. If not, there is a process by which the bottom feeders are swept away, and then there is a runoff election, usually in a matter of weeks, where you have the top two finishers run off, and voters go to the polls and vote again, and then you have a victor after that. The legislative method using the proportional representation or party list method is one that you have to understand the steps and consequences for as well. Remember, we talked in class about the 4 big steps for this. Remember that in the first step, you have parties create a slate of candidates in which they rank their members in order of importance. Second, on election day, voters go to the polls and vote for a party, not an individual. Third, seats in the legislature are allocated in accordance with the percentage of votes that the party receives on election day. And fourth, you have to cross a threshold of votes in order to gain entrance into the legislature for your particular party. And remember that the effect or consequence of the proportional representation system is that you have a multi-party system more often than not. Excuse me. Parties tend to be more ideological than catch-all because even a smaller share of the vote can have you gain access to the legislature. So this tends to be more fractious. It tends to be more maybe representative of the people and more ideological than you would see certainly in a two-party system. Some basic definitions and terms now. There's a lot on this page, and it's in the CPM, and so do make sure that you go back and look at this, but let's go through them. Empirical and normative, remember from the Mexico unit is when we really talk about that, or introduce it anyway. An empirical statement or question is factual, it is data-based, it is unquestionable. A normative statement or question is when there is an opinion or judgment offered up. And so remember, factual, judgment-based, these will be empirical statements will be the is or the obvious ones or the factually backed up. The normative statements or questions, you will have the shoulds or ought tos and so forth, and there will always be an outlier, particularly if that's a multiple choice question. Political structures, from a standpoint, that is a critical page in the CPM that you do have to be very, very strong on to be successful on the AP test. The executive branch is headed by the head of state and head of government. Remember that the head of state is the ceremonial and symbolic representative of the state, whereas the head of government is the person who heads the government, runs the government on a day-to-day basis. The head of government runs the government through the cabinet and is in charge of the day-to-day functioning of the government. They can be combined into one in a presidential system. In the other countries that we talk about, they are separated, and you need to understand in each country how those play out, who holds those key positions, and so forth. The bureaucracy is, in fact, the part of the executive that executes, implements policy as directed by the government. Bureaucrats or civil servants, or sometimes, remember, the bureaucracy is referred to as the civil service. Bureaucrats are theoretically apolitical. They are unelected, and their job is to execute policy as directed by the higher-ups. Legislatively, We have bicameral, 2 houses, and unicameral, 1 house legislatures in this course. Keep that in mind. Their main job is to, of course, pass bills into law and, in a lot of cases, practice oversight of the executive. Judicially, we talk about some big keys in this course. We talk about, does a country have a judiciary with the power of judicial review? Do they have the power in that case where a court can rule the actions of an executive or legislative body null and void? Judicially, is the rule of law strong in a particular country? Is the court system independent? And what type of law do they use in a country? Is it code law, Sharia law, common law, and so forth? Political party standpoint from the structures, we talked about a number of different types of parties, catch-all parties being those relatively moderate parties for whom ideological purity is not important. The importance is, in fact, electoral success. Ideological parties, of course, the opposite of a catch-all party where ideology is the most important. We talk about regional parties like the Scottish National Party and so on, and you have examples on down the line for that. From a citizen types and views of authority standpoint, we talked about a number of different items here. Active citizens, those who are very much engaged on a high level. Your subject citizens who may very well know what's happening. In some cases, not always, but they don't feel a lot of efficacy. Remember that efficacy is that notion that people feel like they can have a say in and influence on political matters in their country. Parochial citizens, oftentimes feeling like they do not have a grasp, or maybe not even understanding that they don't have a grasp, but parochial citizens do not have a grasp on long-term or national issues. They are focused on short-term or just issues in their own lives. And then estranged citizens, when you have citizens who are oftentimes aware of what's going on, but they feel locked out of the system. They may or may not act on their frustrations. Egalitarian views of authority involve equality and the notion that authorities should promote equality. On the very opposite end of that, you have submissive citizens, which goes along with that viewpoint, oftentimes seen in authoritarian states where you submit to the will of authorities, oftentimes out of fear. Deferential citizens fall in the middle of that, where you defer to authority because of your theoretical deference to supposed expertise and so on. Economic systems we have covered in a previous slide, so I won't do that here. The leadership methods, you have a decent grasp of all of this by now. Rational legal leadership, that is a liberal democracy. Rule of law, open elections, you have the education for all, theoretically, again. You have the office and is where the power comes from, not an individual, as opposed to what we'll see in authoritarian states. Traditional leadership, it is either going to be typically a monarchy or religious leadership. Authoritarian states, weakness of the rule of law, oftentimes very, very patronage-based, a lot of nationalism, a lot of submissive citizens. Charismatic leadership, like we've said, oftentimes involves leaders who will inspire passion in their followers for one reason or another, oftentimes blending with another one of the characteristics. And I've already covered economic and political liberalization, so we will bypass that. Systems theory is one way that political scientists explain how politics take place in a country. In this instance, we will start on the left and say that political parties and interest groups take part in the interest articulation phase when people voice their opinions about what is desired, and they do so through interest groups and political parties. Then those inputs go up to the decision-making and interest aggregation part of the chart, where you have the elites make decisions based on what they've heard from inputs and what they consider possible. Then out pops public policy, the output phase, when a state's leaders decide what they ought to do about a particular matter. And then it comes back to citizens and at the feedback stage whereby citizens understand what they hear about policy and then they react to it. And outside of all of that is the environment, and the environment those are things that are outside of politicians' control, things like history, geography, membership in a supranational organization, and such. Sovereignty, autonomy, sphere of influence, hegemony. Four big terms for us. Remember that sovereignty is that notion that the state has control within its borders, that they have independent legal ruling authority over that given population within those borders. Autonomy is going to take place when you have a region within a country, either formally or informally, given powers that allow local or limited self-governance based on a particular matter, oftentimes based on ethnicity or other cultural characteristics, religion. Sphere of influence takes place when you have an area outside a sovereign state over which the great power sovereign state does exercise power politically, economically, and so on. And then you have hegemony, that term for the absolute dominance of one particular political unit over another. Think about the spheres of influence that we've talked about in this class, particularly when it comes to a country like Russia. Remember that Russia, the sphere of influence today, Putin very much sees that as the near abroad. So be able to connect those things when you are studying those terms. Oh, speaking of the near abroad, and there it is. Cleavages, the big two types that we talk about are cumulative and cross-cutting cleavages. Cumulative, think Nigeria, think the Igbo and Christian, think the House of Fulani and Muslim, and think about all the differences that we talk about in class. When you have those cumulative cleavages, you don't have cooperation, you don't have that cross-cutting. Cross-cutting does take place when you have groups with similarities on some issues, differences on others. This is by far the most dangerous of the two types. And we talked about a number of different cleavages. Of course, throughout the class, the social class cleavage between rich and poor. We talked about the gender cleavage and racial cleavages and geographical or regional cleavages, urban, rural. And so apply those to each country. You also have to keep in mind how states have sought to address those cleavages in each country. So it's not only understanding the cleavage definition, but what they are in each country and how the state has sought to address them, for better or for worse. Traits of three types of states. We really have, we didn't do this in the intro unit, but you've gotten a grasp on it throughout the course. You have your industrialized democracies with these types of traits, theoretically, again, strong civil society, strong rule of law, civil liberties that are refined, judiciary that's independent, open and competitive elections. The post-materialist status has been reached, whereby they can not have to focus necessarily on the material, food and housing, but it is focused on women's rights and environmental rights and so on. The less developed or newly industrializing countries oftentimes have different concerns. They may have legitimacy issues. Oftentimes you have ethnic and religious cleavages. You may have import substitution, industrialization used like we saw in Mexico in the 1940s and beyond. Definite social class cleavages, and the differences are laid bare when you consider like the UK to Nigeria and or Mexico. Trends in the contemporary world, we talked about three big ones, and so understand that one has been political liberalization or democratization. And the two types of democracies we've seen play out involve both liberal democracies, whereby you have democracies that feature the rule of law, strong civil liberties, an independent and neutral judiciary, strong civil society that civilian control the military. And then illiberal democracy, think Putin's Russia, where you have elections in a country consistently, but there are violations of civil liberties and rights. Think about everything we talked about in Russia, about the very politicized judiciary. Think about the restrictions on public gatherings. Think about the individual cases, Khodorkovsky and Pussy Riot and such, and you're going to get led in the right direction there. The second big trend has been the movement toward the free market. Lack of success nationally from a command system over the most part of the latter half of the 20th century. Globalization playing into that. And again, I'll say here, yes, capitalism has been the move, but Russia and China promoting that notion of state capitalism now, that has been a challenge to that traditional free market model in the last 20 years or so. And then the third trend is that revival of identity politics, ethnic or cultural politics, whereby you have nationalism play a big role, oftentimes a very politicized notion of religion, and fragmentation, whereby you have that breaking up of bigger countries into smaller countries based on ethnicity, nationality, and so on. Fragmentation also playing out within populations, not necessarily leading to an individual state, but lots of fragmentation within society and even political parties and so on. Political parties, speaking of, this slide's out of place, but I need to get it in somewhere because the College Board likes this stuff. It's an important one to remember, things like this, that in either a democratic or an authoritarian state, political parties do serve very similar purposes. They mobilize masses of citizens. Think about the Communist Party in China and how they mobilize the masses historically. Just like in Britain, parties try to mobilize the masses. They recruit and socialize political leaders, whether that is Margaret Thatcher working her way up through the Tories in the UK, or Xi Jinping working his way up throughout the Communist Party of China from the 1980s and onward. It provides a structured political identity at both the mass and elite levels, and it also serves as a method of control within the state and governmental structure. Civil society, baseline definition is that it's a voluntary association outside of the state. Remember that it's got to be those two things. It's got to be voluntary. It has to be outside of the state. These are just examples of them, and think about civil society in the various countries that we have studied. And think about how strong it is. Think about if the state tries to manage it. Think about why the Russians and Chinese and Iranians are skeptical of civil society. And the examples we laid out. Mexico, with seeing the rise of civil society really after the big earthquake of '85 in Mexico City. Think about how civil society has impacted the countries that we do study. From a political system standpoint, let me just go over several of the keys here, and I'm going to do this again per country, but it's nice to have it in the introductory portion of this as well. The parliamentary system, the big key is that the defining feature is that there is a fusion of powers whereby the executive, the leaders of the members of the government rather, are chosen from the legislature. Remember that the prime minister is first elected as an MP, then chooses the cabinet based on leadership and seniority from the parliament. Collective responsibility is that key parliamentary trait whereby you have the cabinet members must publicly support the government's policy or else they must resign from the cabinet. It only takes a majority vote to pass legislation. Therefore, if the party is loyal, the government is going to be able to pass pretty much whatever they want, assuming they have a majority. Losses of power may occur. We talked about 4 specific types in the UK when we talked about the loss of in a general election, the loss during a leadership contest. We said if a major bill fails to pass, that can be means by which that can happen as well. And then you can have that vote of no confidence go through, where a majority vote in the legislature forces the dismissal of the government. Big key to parliamentary government, or big advantage rather, is that there are clear lines of responsibility. Everyone knows who's responsible for policy, but if it is a multi-party system, oftentimes there is instability as a result of that. Presidential system, the big key is separation of powers versus the fusion of powers in a parliamentary system. There is an electoral independence whereby the executive, the chief executive, is elected independently of the legislature. The president serves as head of state and head of government in a presidential system, as we saw in Mexico and Nigeria. Theoretically, again, the cabinet is chosen more on expertise than party leadership, although that's sketchy if you're paying attention nowadays. Split government or divided government is possible in a presidential system because you can have the executive branch belong to one party, the legislature to the other. Therefore, gridlock is much more possible in a presidential system. And because of that, you have much more ambiguous political accountability versus what you would see in a parliamentary system. One party communist state is defined by one party being in control. Of course, you have the general secretary as the head of the party and the number one person, the Politburo, and in China's case, the Politburo Standing Committee being the top policy-making body in the party and country. Democratic centralism, remember, was that Leninist principle where you had Lenin say that there could be discussion and debate within the party, but ultimately the decisions would be made by the political elite, in this case the Politburo. Then those decisions would be binding on everyone else beneath them. It was a way to instill discipline. It is the organizational principle of the Communist Party in China today and was during the Soviet Union's time as well. Typically, legislatively, it was very weak, it was large, and they were rubber stamped, still is in China. The Politburo and Politburo Standing Committee, in China's case, the top decision-making body in the party, and command system used in both countries until the 1980s when Gorby started to get all after the perestroika, and China went Deng Xiaoping beginning in 1978. Nomenklatura as the recruitment method. Remember that is the list of political elite and the key positions that they will fill, still used in China today. Semi-presidentialism we see in the Russian Federation today. You have a president as head of state, the prime minister as head of government, president's in charge of foreign policy, whereby the prime minister is in charge of domestic policy. Strong presidential powers in Russia's semi-presidential system, for sure. The president is accountable to the citizens via election. Whereby the government, the prime minister and the cabinet are accountable to the legislature because of the possibility of a no confidence vote and so forth. There also is the potential for cohabitation where you have different parties in different positions of power. Theocratically, in Iran, we have both religious and secular elements that are in the state. You have both the religion-based elements, and you also have elected elements that we will take a look at. The elected and secular officials, however, oftentimes, almost always, let's be honest, subordinate to the religious rather, and most often unelected officials. And the theocratic republic basically has those two elements, that they have authority based on religion and religious appointments, and then at the elections of the president and the legislature. So in Iran, for instance, think about the president and the legislature. Those are secular positions, but they're subordinate to the unelected and oftentimes religious positions like the supreme leader, guardian council, expediency council, and so on. Sharia law, along with modern legal codes, to try to blend those together in the Iranian theocratic republic. And there we go.